46 on Daybreak, and this morning we're remembering the landmark case of the Buffalo spammer when the Colts would bolt, and one of the biggest tragedies in Western New York history. It all made news this very week in decades past. Dave McKinley recalls when those stories and more were all news to you.
10 years ago this week, when a growing number of parents frustrated by the Common Core were opting their children out of state standardized tests, Dominic Hasek was inducted into the Sabres Hall of Fame. And just hours after reporters toured the renovations being made to the stadium which bore his name, the one and only owner of the Buffalo Bills up to that point, Ralph Wilson, died at the age of 95 this week in 2014. 20 years ago this week, Howard Carmack, the so-called Buffalo spammer, was put on trial after sending out 853 million junk emails, even though at the time there was no law against that. What they got him on instead was for falsely using the identities of two people to send out that spam, thus running afoul of what was then a brand new state law which made identity theft a crime.
That's how, we're going after these spammers right now, is they're breaking the law in many other ways to send out their spam.
So is it kind of like they got Al Capone on income tax?
Absolutely right.
The Buffalo spammer ended up in the slammer, becoming the first person ever convicted in New York for identity theft. Richard Simmons was still a household name, the Williams sisters were at the tops of their games, and Britney Spears got her star on Hollywood's Walk of Fame this week in 2004. 30 years ago this week, radio shock jock Howard Stern launched a campaign for governor of New York. This week's News to You pop quiz: what were the only two planks in Stern's platform? And here's a hint: New York State would actually come to adopt both of them, even though Stern, who gained the nomination of the Libertarian Party, dropped out of the race after only 5 months. Remember, this was back when big hair was never bigger, when Edward Head was the Catholic Bishop of Buffalo, and when the Comet, which delighted generations of thrill seekers at Crystal Beach, was being reassembled at its new home at Six Flags Great Escape in Lake George, where you can still ride it today. It was also the week when 7 members of the Hartford Whalers in town to play the Sabres found themselves instead in court after being arrested for a brawl at Jim Kelly's Network nightclub, and when an even stranger story surrounded Alexander McGillney, the alleged attempt by one of those who helped him defect to extort him, and how he outsmarted them. It is one heck of a story, but one which we don't have time to tell here, so look for more on WGRZ.com as a News to You extra from this week in 1994. 40 years ago this week was, believe it or not, when Robert Irsay loaded up the Mayflower moving trucks in the middle of the night and took the Colts from Baltimore to Indianapolis. With New York's primary approaching, remaining Democrats seeking that party's nomination for president all came to Buffalo, including Jesse Jackson, Gary Hart, and eventual nominee Walter Mondale, who, while here, was taking questions from a 10-year-old who, by the uniform he wore, could literally have been called a cub reporter. Well, that was enough for us to try and find out what was the deal with this kid.
Tom tells me that eventually he'd like to go on to college and major in journalism and then become either a news or sports reporter. But first, he's got to make sure he gets out of 4th grade.
Well, it turns out 10-year-old Tom here would do both. And while you may not recognize the face, you might know the name and certainly the voice.
From the WBEN Newsroom, I'm Tom Puckett. Here's what's happening.
And Tom Puckett is still living that dream he held since this week in 1984. And finally, 70 years ago this week, one of the greatest tragedies to ever unfold in Western New York's history occurred when 15 children died in a fire at Cleveland Hill Elementary School. And all these years later, you can still see the names of those lives lost this week in 1954, when it was all news to you.
And here is the answer to the pop quiz question, which I actually don't know whether it was in that story. I don't think that we had it in the story, but that was.
What are the two platforms?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm all confused now. The script is gone, the story's gone, but there's Howard Stern. He was running for governor 30 years ago in New York State on the Libertarian Party.